epigenetics, researchers often extrapolate from modern short-term studies of non-human primates or extant small-scale societies as analogies for an evolutionary. Newly developed archaeometric methods can provide fine-grained data at the individual level on breastfeeding and early childhood diet in archaeological populations across evolutionary timescales in people who are living in adaptively relevant environments. The archaeological record is also great because it bypasses many medical and ethical concerns and serves as a natural experiment. So because everyone is already dead, we can also examine relationships between duration of breastfeeding and morbidity and mortality across the lifespan. So I'm going to divide my time discussing breastfeeding and weaning between two populations. I'll spend a bit more time talking about a hunter-gatherer population from California. Then I'll share brand new data from an agricultural population in Bolivia and Peru. That's the result of a collaboration with Kelly Knudsen, who directs the Archaeological Chemistry Lab, and work I've done at the Keck Lab for Environmental Biogeochemistry with Natasha Zolotova. However, before we get into the data, I'm going to give a brief overview of the methods I use to reconstruct ancient diet in people's early lives. So in order to reconstruct the weaning age and diet of ancient peoples, I use two stable isotopes that indicate the protein component of diet that's incorporated into bodily tissues from the things people eat and drink. My main focus today is going to be stable nitrogen isotopes because they display a trophic level effect, where the collagen of a consumer is enriched 2 to 4 per mil over consumed food. So this tracks trophic levels in the food web. And this holds true for breast milk because infants are consuming human protein when they're consuming breast milk. So they're cannibalizing human tissue. So they're elevated 1 trophic level above adults in the population. And permanent first molars provide an ideal window into early life since they grow from birth to age 9 and accrete dentin in layers, a lot like tree rings, that can be tied directly to an individual's age. So I cross-section the tooth and mechanically and chemically remove the inorganic component of the tooth. I cut very thin sections and solubilize the collagen. So I extract only the protein component of the tooth and then run it through a mass spectrometer. So let's see. Oh, that's weird. So before I present my results, I'd like to show you what my data looks like once serial samples from an individual's first molar are run through the mass spectrometer. So I get carbon and nitrogen data back for each sample, to which I can assign a numerical age based upon age-related landmarks. So before I reveal any data, I just want to call your attention to the x-axis, which is age. So each of these samples has been assigned age that this individual was when that section formed. The primary y-axis is the nitrogen, which is going to be our primary focus today. And the secondary y-axis is the carbon. And I'll only touch on that a little bit at the end. So breastfeeding infants are enriched 2 to 4 per mil over adult nitrogen values. So we can see the baseline adult values here. And this is an individual who's breastfeeding. And we're mostly focused on the nitrogen there, which is well above the adult level. And nitrogen will drop during the supplemental feeding and weaning process, typically to the adult baseline levels. And when an individual has reached those adult baseline levels, we consider them to be weaned. And then we can reconstruct childhood diet sort of on a 6 to 12 month basis. And typically, infants and young children will be consuming diets pretty similar to those of adults. However, this can vary later in childhood as some children begin supplementing provision food with foods they forage themselves. And because most often they're less effective foragers than adults, their diet looks a bit different. But I'm only going to be focused on weaning at this point. This is just to give you a preview of what all this can do. So I want to introduce you to our first study population, which is ancient California. So I have 120 individuals from 10 Bay Area sites across a diversity of ecological zones that span 6,000 years of prehistory. So this is from about 7,000 years ago to right before contact with Spanish. And at contact with the Spanish, this was the Ohlone culture area. And ancient California is a super cool place, and I unfortunately can't spend a whole hour talking about it today, so I'll just give you a super quick rundown. Californians were complex hunter-gatherers. They were egalitarian, and status was earned through wealth accumulation, and they had individual property ownership. There was an extraordinarily high population density at contact with Spanish, supported in part by the acorn economy. And there was extreme linguistic and cultural diversity, rivaled only by Papua New Guinea. And California was affected by a worldwide event called the medieval warming period, or the medieval climatic anomaly. And I'm just going to call it the warming period from here on out. And this started around 1100 and lasted until 700 BP. And it is obviously associated with warming, and also associated with very severe episodic droughts that could vary anywhere from 30 years to 200 years. So in some cases, individuals could see things change dramatically in their lifetime, not for the better. So archaeologically, this is associated with pretty drastic settlement and subsistence shifts, increased food insecurity, increased disease, and we can see evidence of this in pathological conditions in skeletal remains from this time period. We also see dramatic increases in interpersonal violence. So one of these pictures is an obsidian projectile point that has bisected someone's spinal column, not a survivable injury. And this other person has some pretty serious blunt force trauma to their cranium. So we know that reproductive strategies alter in response to environmental and social factors. And that reproductive strategies and tactics are reflected in parental investment in offspring. And weaning age is a very good measure of parental investment. So one of my big research questions is, do mothers shift their strategies in the face of climate change, food shortage, and violence? So how did this affect women in ancient California who were experiencing these adverse experiences? So before I go further, I want to point out that weaning is a process, not an event. And while I might be pinpointing a single time period in an individual's life where they're transitioning, it's not cut and dry. So Dan Sellen's work examining infant feeding patterns cross-culturally nicely demonstrates that weaning is this process, and that supplemental foods are initially serving as a top-off when infant caloric needs outstrip maternal milk production, but that mothers continue high milk production for long durations after beginning supplemental feeding. And this data of Dan Sellen's from non-industrial societies and my data from the archaeological record refute a common concern in public health that early introduction of supplemental foods necessarily leads to inappropriately early weaning ages. So with that, I will transition to the data on supplemental foods in ancient California. So we can see that there's pretty high inter-individual variation in the timing of the introduction of supplemental foods. So on average, it's around 8 months prior to the warming period and drops to 6 to 7 months during and after the warming period. And this mean is above the World Health Organization recommendation of introduction of supplemental foods at 6 months. But there's high variation. So people are getting supplemental foods anywhere from 3 to 12 months of age. So the takeaway from this is that it's highly variable and that these averages are obviously not telling the whole story here. So what are kids being fed as supplemental foods? What adults are eating, basically, which isn't all that surprising. The dietary variation is best predicted by ecology. So if you're living on the Bay Shore, you are eating shellfish and fish as your supplemental foods. And if you're living inland, you are eating plant foods, so ground acorns, seeds. So there's not really baby food. There's adult food or everyone food that's being specifically processed for infants, pre-masticated or pulverized. And in some cases, the way this is being prepared in California isn't any different for adults than it is for children. There's a lot of mush. So weaning age does drop during the warming period. There's a statistically significant shift from around 34 to 32 months of age before the warming period to around 24 months of age during the warming period. So this is nearly a year different. And there's no significant increase after the warming period. So there's variation between individuals in all time periods. But I think it's interesting that even though there's this dramatic drop, in all these time periods, parents on average are meeting or exceeding the World Health Organization recommendation of breastfeeding until 24 months of age. And when we compare age at death to weaning age as sort of a broad scale proxy for how duration of breastfeeding might impact longevity and health throughout the lifespan, we can see that weaning age is a poor predictor of post-infancy survival during the warming period. And this is consistent with the idea that in a time period with high extrinsic mortality, parental investment is a poor predictor of offspring survival. And there's generally reduced life expectancy during and after the warming period. When weaning age is compared to the rates of skeletal pathologies indicative of dietary stress or poor health in early childhood, there's a correlation between reduced weaning age and increased rates of product hyperostosis and enamel hypoplasia. And these trends in pathology rates have been independently noted in other broad-scale bioarchaeological studies in the region, which suggests that just generally reduced access to breast milk increases rates of morbidity early in life. So to summarize my findings from ancient California, there's high variability the World Health Organization recommends. And weaning ages are significantly younger during the warming period. So during the stressful time period where extrinsic mortality is higher, women are weaning their children at younger ages. And with younger weaning ages, we see higher pathology rates. And this brings up an interesting point, which is it appears that there's health benefits to receiving breast milk past 24 months, which is what the World Health Organization recommends. So infants way back when were realizing benefits of increased milk consumption past 24 months. So we also know that in addition to negative impacts from adverse experiences like climate change and violence, women's choices to breastfeed and the duration with which they breastfeed are affected by their involvement in their economy, whether it's a wage economy like ours or a subsistence economy, because time spent allocated to labor in an office or gathering or growing your food can't also be spent on direct infant care. So the degree to which women participate in economies varies cross-culturally and between different subsistence patterns. So in California, women were eating around 80% of the calories during and after the warming period, which is a huge